Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday, the 3rd of December in London. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up today, France's government could collapse as soon as tomorrow after opposition parties file no confidence motions over the country's budget.
As SpaceX's valuation heads for the moon, Elon Musk's $100 billion Tesla pay packet crash lands thanks to a Delaware judge.
Plus, a special report on the chronic financial and technical problems that have repeatedly delayed the EU's biometric border system. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
France's government is on the brink of collapse after opposition lawmakers filed 2 motions of no confidence in the administration of Prime Minister Michel Barnier. Marine Le Pen's National Rally and a leftist alliance have both called votes, which could happen as early as tomorrow evening. Together, they have enough members of the National Assembly to topple the government. Barnier appealed to his fellow politicians for their support.
This bill is now here. Now is the time to act to implement it. I believe we've now reached a moment of truth which confronts everyone with their responsibilities. It's now up to you, members of the Parliament of the nation, to decide whether our country adopts responsible financial texts, essential and useful to our fellow citizens.
Michel Barnier speaking there in the National Assembly, invoking a constitutional override to force his social security budget through Parliament, which then triggered the confidence votes. The government must adopt a budget by the end of the year or use an untested emergency law to avoid a shutdown.
Well, France's political uncertainty is putting French bonds and stocks under renewed selling pressure. The spread between French and German borrowing costs widened to 89 basis points on Monday. That's close to the most since 2012. Ian Steely, international fixed income CIO at JP Morgan Asset Management, says the risk is too high.
I think at the moment you've got to be probably standing on the sidelines, because ultimately what we're seeing is unprecedented. It looks like we're going to have a collapse of the government. It causing questions about what budget is likely to be able to occur next year. Yes, the spreads are very wide at the moment and they're hitting levels that we saw back in the peripheral Eurozone crisis. But actually, when I look at just European debt in general, I think there's just some much better stories out there.
Ian Steely there, speaking to Bloomberg Television. The French budget bill, initially presented by the Prime Minister Michel Barnier's government, sought to reduce France's deficit to 5% of economic output in 2025 through 60 billion euros of tax increases and spending cuts. But the budget minister, Laurent Saint-Martin, told Le Parisien newspaper over the weekend that the National Rally's demands to amend the budget would cost nearly 10 billion euros.
The UK can have a close relationship with both the US and the EU, according to the Prime Minister. In a keynote speech on foreign affairs at the Lord Mayor's annual banquet in central London, Keir Starmer emphasised the importance of working with both to serve the UK's national interest.
Against the backdrop of these dangerous times, the idea that we must choose between our allies, that somehow we're with either America or Europe, is plain wrong. I reject it utterly.
Keir Starmer also used his speech to express support for Ukraine in its conflict with Russia and suggest the UK should engage with a wider range of countries, including China. The comments from the British Prime Minister come as some have voiced concern that President-elect Donald Trump's plans to ramp up tariffs will drive a wedge between the allies. Overnight, Trump said that he would nominate investment banker Warren Stevens to be the US ambassador to the UK, tapping a prominent Republican donor and businessman for a prime diplomatic post.
Fed policymakers say that they expect to continue cutting interest rates over the next year, but won't commit to a cut this month. 3 Federal Reserve officials shared their thoughts on the path ahead on Monday. Here is Governor Christopher Waller.
At present, I lean towards supporting a cut to the policy rate at our December meeting. But that decision will depend on whether data that we receive before then surprises to the upside and alters my forecast for the path of inflation.
Governor Christopher Waller's comments were echoed by New York Fed President John Williams and his counterpart from Atlanta, Raphael Bostic, who said that economic conditions merit more cuts, but stopped short of saying that they favour a December reduction. Fed officials will gather for their next meeting on the 17th and 18th of this month.
Israel's military says the country remains obligated to a US-backed ceasefire after carrying out airstrikes in Lebanon on Monday. The strike came after Hezbollah fired a rocket at an Israeli military site in a disputed area near the borders with Lebanon and Syria. The fragile ceasefire between the two sides has been in place for less than a week and suspended more than a year of hostilities that had raged in parallel to the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza.
SpaceX is in discussions to sell insider shares that could boost the value of Elon Musk's rocket and satellite company to around $350 billion. According to people familiar with the matter, conversations are ongoing and the details of a potential transaction could change depending on interest from sellers and buyers. However, if it moves forwards, it would cement SpaceX's status as the most valuable private startup in the world. The potential valuation surge underscores the enormous gains that Musk's empire has seen since the US presidential election. Tesla shares are up by more than 40% since the 5th of November, with the Bloomberg Billionaires Index now putting Elon Musk's wealth at more than $350 billion US.
But it's not all good news for the world's richest person. Elon Musk's record-setting multi-billion-dollar Tesla pay package has again been rejected by a Delaware court. That's despite shareholders supporting its reinstatement. More from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
Tesla says it will appeal despite the June 13th shareholder vote at the company's annual meeting. A Delaware Chancery Court judge decided to stick with her original finding in January that the company's board was too much under the influence of the billionaire entrepreneur when it adopted the plan in 2018. The stock options package was initially worth $2.6 billion and spiked to $56 billion by the time the judge canceled it. McCormick's ruling, striking down the largest ever pay arrangement for a U.S. corporate executive, could take a giant bite out of Musk's wealth. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
And those are our top stories for you this morning. Let's check on the markets then. After the S&P 500 yesterday notched up another record close, yes, another one, 54th record close, just shy of 6,050. US stock futures this morning are a little bit brighter, up by about 0.1%. US stock 50 futures, though, gaining 0.4 this morning. You also do have gains in Asian equity trading. So the Nikkei 225 up by 2%, heading for the best day in a month. The CSI 300, though, only seeing a gain of 0.3%. As for the dollar, again, we are back on the front foot for the greenback, up 0.1%. As for the euro this morning, trading slightly softer, but of course heightened likelihood of a government collapse in France weighing on that. And Brent crude futures currently highest 0.3%, $72.09. Those are the markets.
In a moment, we'll bring you more on the political turmoil in France, plus new documents seen by Bloomberg that reveal the problems behind the scenes of the EU's new biometric border system. Another story that caught our eye this morning. We're counting down to the official reopening of Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris this weekend. Donald Trump says that he's going to be travelling to attend. He had been invited, so that's not entirely a surprise, but nonetheless, it's going to be quite the big international affair. We are going to be seeing, quite a lot of famous names and faces.
Apparently 50 heads of state or government are going to be at the official reopening of Notre-Dame, of course, 5 years after the devastating fire in 2019. I'm sure you were living in Paris at the time. You must have been, thinking about that. In terms of the restoration, though, actually it's President Emmanuel Macron who was one of the first to enter Notre-Dame, and there have been already pictures of this bright, light cathedral that's been brought back to life, in part by huge amounts of money that were raised from some of the richest, wealthiest and best-known French citizens.
Yeah, indeed. The amount of money that's been poured into this, kind of around 800 million euros, in fact, of donations to restore the cathedral. The pictures from inside it do look pretty impressive to see how much has been done to restore it, and I'm sure many people in that part of the city and those visiting as well will be happy to be able to get a look inside it again after it's been under construction. But in many ways it's remarkable how quickly they've been able to restore such a historic building to its former glory in the 5 years since the fire. Yep, absolutely. Going to be a whole series of big events before actually visitors and worshippers can get back into the cathedral starting at the weekend. Now we're going to stay in France now. Michel Barnier has tried to bypass Parliament to pass his social security financing bill. Two no confidence votes are now on the books that could happen as early as tomorrow. Let's get the latest from Paris. Our French equity markets reporter Julien Pontus joins us for more. Julien, good morning. What's the timing involved here? When might these votes happen and how likely are they to be passed?
We're thinking probably Wednesday night, Wednesday evening, maybe on Thursday. That's not set yet. There is very, very, very little hope that Barnier's government will survive these votes. When you look at the number of MPs from the opposition, you're over 300, well over 300. So it's really hard to see how he could escape defeat on that one. OK, what happens if the French government falls, Julien, if that happens this week and then there's no budget in place until January? Well, there's a number of options. There's nothing that prevents President Macron of reappointing Barnier. Could also leave Barnier as a caretaker government, looking for a new prime minister, a new government. There are provisions in the French constitution that, allow the government to keep on spending, paying the civil servants, paying social welfare, pensions, etc. But at the end of the day, eventually a solution, a sustainable solution will need to be found. But there's no risk of a shutdown, a US-style shutdown. But that doesn't mean there's no tension on the bond market, on the euro, on the stock market. We're really in uncharted territory here. Talk us through what we've seen so far on markets and where the risks lie in this uncertain period for markets. Well, yesterday, a bit of a surprise was the French stock market ended in the green and positive territory. You would have expected more stress, but then again, a lot of it has been priced. The French stock market has done really horribly this year. It's down roughly 5%. When the stock 600 is up 5-6%, there's a 10% gap, which is quite huge. It's the worst year of the French stock market since the 2012 crisis. In comparison to its European peers. The main reaction yesterday was on the euro. The euro lost about 1%. So that was really where the market action was. In terms of the bond market, the spread is high. That's true with Germany. It's close to 90, and it's also more or less at the levels it was during the sovereign crisis. But good news, if you can see it as good news, the French 10 years is under 3%. In the great scheme of things is not much. So in terms of refinancing costs of really a financial crisis, you're still at a level which is not, worrying. The spread is worrying. The fact that 10-year trades at the same level as Greece is worrying. But all in all, it's less than 3%. It's still reasonable. So, Julien, do you think it's becoming a Eurozone crisis? What would the best outcome now be for markets as we think about 2025? Well, the best outcome right now is by, Barnier or Macron being able to convince the little group of socialists, 60 of them, not to vote, to abstain, and to save the Barnier government. Seems unlikely, but it's one of the only ways for Barnier to survive this. Then there are a lot of options, but the main problem is that you cannot have elections, general elections, before the summer. So whatever you do, you're stuck with a parliament that is divided in three fiercely opposed factions, the left, the center, and the far right. And it's really hard to see how you can pull out a coalition from there. So I would think maybe a caretaker government, maybe a technical government with, someone like the equivalent of Draghi, what Prime Minister Draghi did in Italy, and then wait it out till you can have fresh elections in the summer. Of course, there's one taboo at the moment. It's, Macron. No one is really thinking he will resign at this point. But, after a while, if the financial conditions really do deteriorate, maybe people will start thinking, well, maybe the solution would be for him to resign.
Okay, well, certainly an interesting few days ahead for you. Thank you very much for joining us, Julien Pontus, for our French equity reporter there, joining us from Paris.
Another story from Europe now. The European Union has pushed back the start of its smart border system until next year. Now, this is the fourth delay in 5 years. New documents seen by Bloomberg show a consortium involving the French tech firm Atos is at the centre of many of the problems. Joining us now is Bloomberg's technology editor, Olivia Solon, to explain. Great to have you on, Olivia. What is the entry-exit system supposed to do in Europe?
It's supposed to be a large-scale IT project that's meant to make border control an EU issue rather than a national issue. At the moment, the EU has no good kind of automated way of tracking how long people from outside the EU without visas stay inside the bloc. When someone comes into a country within the EU, the individual country will stamp their passport when they arrive, but then they have no way of knowing whether people travel to other EU countries and when or if they leave. So what EES does is integrates the immigration systems of every EU country and then registers and checks the biometric data of people, their faces and their fingerprints, as they go in and out of the EU. And so in theory, this is supposed to better measure irregular migration, reduce identity fraud, and ultimately help secure the EU's borders.
Why has the launch date been delayed so many times?
Well, it is a complex IT project, and public IT projects are often delayed. But the documents that we've seen do show that the consortium involving Atos was a bit of a mess. Atos itself is going through a lot of challenges at the moment. It's got a lot of debt. It had to be effectively bailed out by its creditors. And according to the documents and the people we spoke to over the years, Atos and the other consortium members missed pretty much every deadline at the beginning. They partially installed equipment, misplaced parts. They took weeks to fix bugs in software, and they were sending teams with just little experience, at least according to the documents we've seen. And then the consortium itself just couldn't get along. The other members were IBM and Italian defense firm Leonardo, who was doing the security. The EU agency responsible for the project, called EU LISA, had to set up emergency daily meetings to try and move the project along. And what would happen was the consortium members would just argue among themselves in front of their client. It just seemed to be a sort of comedy of errors of a public procurement project.
Oh dear. The knock-on effects, though, what have those been in terms of, what the delays have done?
Well, it's supposed to be a kind of backbone system onto which they can kind of peg other immigration systems. So every delay to EES means delays to all these other systems. For example, there's a 200 million euro visa waiver system called, that's a bit like the ESTA when you go into the US. And that can't launch until EES is launched. And the agency responsible for that system, called Frontex, had hired 130 people ready and raring to work on this project, and they've now had to be reassigned. And that seems to be happening at borders in member states as well, where they've hired a bunch of people ready to deploy the system, which was last scheduled to launch in November. And then in October, they suddenly changed their mind and said, actually, we're not going to launch until 2025.
Is there any recourse for the EU agency that's paying for all of this, given the delays?
The contract does allow the agency to charge damages for missed milestones, and there's lots of discussion about that in the documents we've seen. And there are also additional costs that were incurred because of the delays for extra fees for software licenses that had to be extended longer than expected. And the agency could sue for compensation for these costs. And that, again, is discussed in the documents. But so far, I don't think either of those things have happened.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.